Kia ora, ko Max Harris tōku ingoa, he Pākehā hau. I'm Max, I'm Pākehā. I first really got involved in campaigning when I got involved actually in Just Speak and Generation Zero when I was just out of school in my early 20s. And since then I've been involved in a lot of criminal justice campaigning, a lot of work around social policy and international issues, and I now work part-time at ActionStation as a campaigner. I've tried to focus my efforts by thinking about where I think the most change is needed, where we have some of the most significant social and political issues calling for action, like climate change, inequality, international solidarity, and then also thinking about, I suppose, the skills that I have and where I can support work. So yeah, I try to support with media work now, where I have a bit of experience with policy work and also with some legal litigation work. So I guess to sum that up, I try to focus my efforts based on where I think the need is and where I think I can be useful. Young people have a hugely important place in our politics in Aotearoa. I think young people come in all different shapes and sizes, but tend to be more imaginative and more impatient, and tend to be less closed down by a sense of what we should be doing or how we should be acting. And I think that's a really powerful force for creative solutions. I also don't think that all of the burden should fall on young people to solve the world's problems, and I think some of the most effective advocacy I've been involved with has been young people working with older people who pass on contacts and lessons to build intergenerational partnerships for social change. So to summarise that, I think young people are hugely important. They can be a driving force for change, but need the support of all of us. I think there's a few reasons why there's a discrepancy between awareness and action on climate change. I think one reason is we can all sometimes feel like climate change is too big a problem and we can feel hopeless about the solutions, and we know that climate anxiety and a sense of bleakness about the future is really real. I think another reason is that related to that, it can feel too big a problem for any one person or one community to contribute to. And I think another challenge is people figuring out how we fit into the solution. But I think all of those barriers can be overcome, especially for young people. I think groups like Generation Zero can show the way in highlighting that there are real actions that can be taken. I think we know that actually those contributing to climate change can be pinpointed quite specifically. We know, for example, that big corporates contribute a significant amount of emissions, and there are some really targeted steps we can take to reduce emissions. I also think groups like Generation Zero and others can help to remind us that this problem isn't too big, that this problem can be solved, and that we all have a part to play in using our skills to try to address this problem. So I think where to start on an issue like climate change is usually with an analysis of the context that we're in, the political context. And what I mean by that is thinking about who has power right now, who are the decision makers that we could influence, who do those decision makers listen to, who are the messengers that could be useful to get at those decision makers, what are some of the big ideas and other forces that are relevant to influencing those decision makers. So that's the political context and the political analysis. Then thinking about in an organisation, be it Generation Zero or ActionStation, what are the skills or networks or relationships that we have that could influence those decision makers or those ideas that are part of the context. Then thinking about what are some of the very specific concrete actions we can take using our relationships, networks, skills to target that political context. That's how I'd start. Hopefully that's not too abstract or high level. Yeah, this is just a personal view, but I think that in some ways, it's very rational that some people, including young people, feel like it's all too complicated and all too big, because there have been some people who deliberately want to block action and who deliberately want to make this seem like too complicated a problem for action. In particular, in the past, that has been fossil fuel companies who have tried to delay and obfuscate the release of information about the contribution of fossil fuel industries to climate change. There are a few different things that have to change. I think, in general, my personal view is that one big part of climate change is having too much of a focus on the profit driver in our economic system, which means that there is a priority placed on the money to be made by companies, and that corners can be cut on the way to companies kind of making revenue, and that actually we need to think about the role of government in providing the scale that's needed to tackle climate solutions, but also perhaps to shift the kind of economy we have away from one that's focused on profit to one that's focused on people and planet. What does that mean concretely? That means perhaps things like public investment in green infrastructure. So one thing I've worked on is an idea of a Ministry of Green Works, which another climate activist, India Logan Riley, is building a campaign around at the moment. In this country, it also means thinking about solutions away from the profit motive that are grounded in Māori history and Māori ideas and knowledges. And that means empowering Māori, iwi, hapu, other Māori entities to ensure that they have the power to contribute to climate solutions. And it means making sure that we have an understanding of environmental justice, so who is affected most by climate change, how climate change tends to disproportionately affect those who are already marginalised in our society, and how any solution to climate change also has to raise the power and the resources that those groups have. I don't think that's the right way of approaching climate change. So yeah, I think that climate change can't be seen as being in its own hermetically sealed container. I think climate change is connected to many other issues, and so solutions to climate change also need to be connected to many other areas of policy. And we could take a few examples of that. So one example is managed retreat, which is about how we're going to ensure mobility of people away from threats posed by climate change, in particular people in coastal communities. That's an issue that is to do with climate change, but it's also to do with where people live, the kind of housing that people have, the kind of urban planning that happens, and actually broader resource management planning that happens, and it requires thinking on multiple levels and with different kinds of expertise. That's just one example. Another example is if our economy is part of the problem and we need to remake the economy towards a greener economy, for example, an economy with more public transport, that requires us to think about how can we encourage people to use public transport more, perhaps moving towards fares-free public transport. That requires us to think about what's fair. It requires us to figure out what people can pay, if anything. It requires us to think about infrastructure. So those are just two examples where climate solutions in transport and managed retreat require us to have lots of different skills and to work across different communities and to fight the battle on lots of different fronts. Yeah, as you say, I think a certain level of minimal education is important for people to know that climate change is happening, that it's a human-caused problem, and that we can do something about it. But I do think education and awareness is important so that we understand what the right solutions are. So yeah, in my view, like I've said, I think climate change also requires us to shift our economic system and to think about colonisation and unwinding the effects of colonisation. And I think understanding the roots can help to ensure that we're tackling the problem at its roots. So yeah, I think education and awareness raising are crucial. But then I think also we have to think about how do we shift the power structures that we have so that we transform the economic system and the system that we have that's based on colonisation, and that requires going beyond education into action. Yeah, it's a really tricky question, but I think moves around the world to teach some aspects of climate change in the secondary school system are really important. So I think it is important for people to understand the basic science of climate change and also humans' role in it. I also do support New Zealand history being taught in schools, and I think that could be developed further. I support Te Reo Māori being taught in New Zealand schools, and also further thinking about the history of colonisation in New Zealand, as well as ways of moving beyond it. So, for example, there's a really exciting document called Matike Mai, which is about a different kind of political vision, and I think it would be great if that was brought into the education system, including in schools. I also think some level of political education, civics education is helpful in schools so that people don't feel like the political system is totally foreign or not for us. So yeah, I think, just to summarise, I think having basic science education about climate change, having historical education about colonisation in this country, as well as Te Reo Māori, and some political civics education would all be important for tackling climate change. Yeah, so I think, as with any group that isn't currently engaged by the political system, I think we need a transfer of power and resources to young people to make sure that young people are able to feel engaged. What does that mean concretely? I think allowing younger people to vote would be a helpful thing. I support the Make It 16 campaign to lower the voting age to 16 at local and national elections, but also thinking about how can we provide resources for young people so that we all feel like we have power over decisions, not just the ability to vote. What that could mean is empowering more community centres and youth centres where young people are able to engage and have resources at their disposal, including for campaign groups, including so that there are venues for campaign groups and policy groups to meet. It could also mean that young people's voices are enshrined in legislation. At the moment in Auckland, Auckland Council does have to listen to young people, but it's expressed in quite a thin, weak way in legislation. So we could beef up that legislation to make sure that young people have to be listened to. And I think it takes politicians taking young people more seriously and committing to end the demonisation of young people that happens in lots of different ways. So yeah, to try to summarise that, I think we need to transfer power and resources to young people, to change our laws, to set up institutions that support young people, and to change how our politicians talk about young people. So I'd actually flip that question, because I don't think mainly it's young people's fault that a lot of young people are disengaged by politics. So I think the question should be, how should our political system be changed to make sure that young people are engaged? What more can the political system do to engage young people? And I know I've talked about that a little bit already, but I think having younger politicians can help with that, including younger councillors at the local government level. Having politicians that talk in a language that's accessible, not necessarily in a cringe way, but a language of values that we can all grasp and understand. And then I think young people would feel comfortable in politics and feel perhaps less disillusioned and desensitised by politics just appearing to be a cycle of cliches and mantras that aren't meaningful for people's lives. But to try to answer your question directly, I think with the right kinds of politicians and the right kinds of resources, there's a lot that young people can do. So there are lots of resources online to compare the policies of different parties. For example, the policy tool that I think you can find at policy.co.nz. For young people that are engaged, I think you can help other young people to be engaged in politics. ActionStation's doing something quite specific this election called vote tripling. That's about one person thinking about 3 people you know and persuading those 3 people who otherwise might not vote to vote and to vote with your values. And the reason that's important is we know that actually people respond better to people you know. And so an organisation or a political party comes and tells you to vote and you don't know who they are, you might not be so interested. But if you're someone from the same community or from the same background, you're more likely to respond well. So that's something that young people who are engaged might be able to do. And there's lots of other things that young people can do, but engaging with those political tools, trying to engage with the media, and helping to work towards a different political system, those are some of the things that might be possible. I think voting is important and really important, and I think it is a way to express your voice, to make sure that you are heard. But I do think that sometimes when we talk about politics, we focus too much on parliament and parliamentary politics, and I think politics is about more than parliamentary politics. Politics is about power, and power comes up in your family, comes up at school, comes up in your community, and all of those spaces are political. And so I think actually there are lots of other things you can do apart from voting, like having a conversation in each of those spaces, challenging people in power who you think are wielding power in an unjust way, building support with like-minded people. You can do that without being in Parliament or even being close to it. So yeah, voting is crucial, but politics is about more than voting and more than parliamentary politics. Yeah, so one of the things that I got involved with early on was criminal justice policy and wanting to push for a different kind of debate on what we do when social harm happens so that we don't just throw people into prison and do things that we know are ineffective. And what we did when we set up Just Speak was actually we had the support of an older person, Kim Workman, really amazing thinker and actor on justice. But we started by just coming together and finding each other and then holding monthly forums on different justice topics. And that started out with like 20 or so people coming to topics on like gangs and drugs and prisons. But over time we built that up to about 100 to 150 people coming to these monthly forums. We had free pizza. We were able to get funding to make sure that people could show up. And then through that we started to build different kinds of actions. So we wrote policy reports, we did submissions to select committees, we got people in their own communities to organise. We hosted a big youth camp with 120 people at Taputaranga Marae in Wellington. And over time we were trying to expand that community of people committed to change on justice. So that's partly how I got involved with justice issues and some of the things that I did at the outset. There's so many resources out there, and I think one of the challenges on the internet is the sense that there's a lot of poor quality information as well as a lot of great information. I think it really depends on what kind of person you are. So I think there are some great books out there for people that are more into reading. I've learned a lot from the work of people like Naomi Klein and Andreas Malm. Their books like This Changes Everything by Naomi Klein are a really important way in, a gateway drug, if you will, to climate change action and understanding. I think if you're less of a book person, there's lots of movies out there that really highlight the impact of climate change and the approach of different communities. I mean, lots of people will know An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore's movie from years ago, but I think more recently, there are a lot of other movies which maybe we could talk more about. There are podcasts out there as well. There are also communities, and I'd really encourage people to look up different kind of campaign groups, so not just Generation Zero, but as we've just talked about, groups like 350 Aotearoa, groups like Oxfam, Greenpeace, Pacific Climate Warriors, Te Ara Whatu. Finding those groups that connect to you is a way to meet like-minded people and then find ways to act on climate change. There are a few ways you can avoid, I think, preaching to the choir. I think one is to think about who's in positions of leadership more broadly, including across a kind of committee, and making sure that you are representing different communities, and so that new people feel like they are represented in that group, and it's not already just a group of people very heavily involved. And so I think that's a reason to have people in leadership who might even be new to issues of climate advocacy and action. That's one point. I think another point is encouraging people in through kind of hospitality and things like having food where possible, being really welcoming, being clear that it's not a kind of group only for experts, but that there are no stupid questions and that people will be welcomed. I think using creative tactics is important, being in different spaces. We were talking earlier about TikTok and different social media. I think that's a way to reach out to different people. I also think being in different spaces can be helpful. So I know you're based in a university. I was involved with a political education project last year called the NICO project, and we were doing big discussions on ideas like environmental justice or prison abolition or the history of capitalism. These are big ideas, and one thing that we tried to do is host these discussions in different spaces across Auckland. So we had sessions at Wheke Fortress in Onehunga, the 312 Hub, so just around the corner, the Samoa House Library, and I think that use of different spaces was really helpful, and it meant that different people felt connected and at home. So yeah, lots of different ideas, but the gist of it is, I think, having diverse leadership, speaking accessibly and welcoming people in, using creative tactics, and being in different spaces can all make sure you're not just preaching to the choir. I think that's a very understandable feeling, that politics can be quite uninspiring sometimes, and it can feel like politics in Wellington is quite distant from people, especially from people who are in communities who aren't well represented in Parliament. So I think the first thing to say is I think that's valid, but what I would say is that if you feel unrepresented in Parliament, actually having conversations and making sure your voice is heard in different ways in those conversations, but also through your vote, might be a first step towards changing that kind of politics. What I'd also say is that votes really do matter. We're lucky to have an MMP system in this country where you are able to vote for parties as well as local electorates. In some parts of the world, you only can vote in a local electorate and your vote doesn't really matter, but your vote truly does matter. And I'd also say that it's good to think about your values and your political perspectives. So even if you don't think of yourself as a very political person, you likely have values. You have values in how you might talk to your family or your community or your friends. And you probably have political positions and opinions, even if you might not describe them that way. So I think if you have time, reflect on those values, vote with your values, and if you're enthusiastic about voting, then try to persuade other people as well, because as I said earlier, that's one of the most powerful ways we can ensure that young people and all people are well represented.